In this video, we will examine a chilling pattern that cuts against everything policing is supposed to represent. These are not stories of criminals hunted by the badge, but crimes committed behind it. Cases where authority became access and trust became a weapon. From traffic stops that turned fatal to domestic deaths disguised as accidents, each case exposes how power, when left unchecked, can distort justice itself. Gerard John Schaefer, State, Florida, 49 years old. Born in 1946 in Wisconsin, Gerard John Schaefer Jr. entered the world without any public warning signs of the violence that would later define his name. Between 1969 and 1972, a disturbing pattern began to form across rural and semi-isolated areas of Florida. Teenage girls and young women started vanishing along highways, back roads, and wooded stretches where help was far away and witnesses were scarce. At the time, these disappearances were treated as separate incidents, runaways, bad luck, isolated crimes. What investigators could not yet see was the common thread: a police officer who understood patrol routines, response times, and the psychology of compliance. Schaefer is suspected of using his badge to initiate contact, presenting himself as an authority figure before transitioning into a predator. The full number of his victims has never been determined. Estimates range from several confirmed cases to dozens of suspected murders, many of which may never be solved due to missing evidence and bodies that were never recovered. The facade finally collapsed in July 1972. Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, both 17 years old, were hitchhiking when they encountered Schaefer. To them, he was not a threat. He was a uniformed police officer offering control, order, and presumed safety. Instead, he used official handcuffs to restrain them, transforming a symbol of protection into an instrument of terror. He drove the girls into a remote wooded area, far from any immediate chance of rescue. There, he bound them to trees and murdered them. When their bodies were later discovered, the crime scene revealed not just brutality, but calculation. Choices made by someone who understood how crimes were investigated and how evidence could disappear in rural terrain. Schaefer's arrest later that year marked a turning point, not just in the case, but in how authorities viewed him. A search of his residence uncovered material that stunned even seasoned investigators. Among his possessions were handwritten manuscripts and writings describing acts of abduction, restraint, torture, and murder in graphic detail. What made these documents particularly chilling was how closely they mirrored real, unsolved cases. The line between fantasy and confession blurred beyond recognition. These writings suggested that the murders of Place and Jessup were not isolated acts, but part of a much longer and darker pattern, one that law enforcement may have unknowingly enabled by placing him in a position of power. In 1973, Schaefer stood trial and was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. He received 2 life sentences, effectively removing him from society without the possibility of release. While he avoided the death penalty, the sentence ensured that he would never walk free again. For the families of the victims, the verdict brought a measure of closure, but also frustration. The evidence hinted at far more victims than the court could legally acknowledge. Justice was served, but it was incomplete, bound by what could be proven rather than what was suspected. The prison did not silence Schaefer. From 1973 through the mid-1990s, he continued to write obsessively, producing stories and letters steeped in violence and domination. In correspondence with outsiders and fellow inmates, he frequently implied that the crimes for which he was convicted represented only a fraction of what he had done. These hints fueled ongoing speculation among investigators that numerous missing persons cases from the early 1970s might trace back to him. In 1995, any remaining chance of extracting further information from Schaefer ended abruptly. He was killed by another inmate inside a Florida prison, bringing a violent end to a life defined by manipulation and cruelty. With his death came a permanent silence. Any undisclosed burial sites, unconfessed crimes, or names of forgotten victims were buried with him. For law enforcement, the case became a grim lesson in institutional vulnerability. For the public, it shattered a deeply held assumption that the uniform itself guarantees safety. Schaefer's story endures not only because of the brutality of his crimes, but because of what they reveal about unchecked authority. His case forces an uncomfortable reckoning when power, trust, and knowledge of the system converge in the wrong hands. The damage can extend far beyond what the justice system is able to repair. How many victims were lost because they trusted a badge, and how many similar warning signs might still be overlooked today? Craig Peyer, State, California, 75 years old. Born in 1959 in California, Craig Allen Peyer followed a path that outwardly reflected stability, authority, and public trust. He chose a career in law enforcement and eventually joined the California Highway Patrol, a role that granted him sweeping control over traffic stops, roadside encounters, and the safety of motorists. On the night of December 27, 1986, that assumption collapsed. Cara Nutt, a 20-year-old college student, was driving home alone after spending Christmas with her family. It was late, close to midnight, and the highway through San Diego County was quiet. When Peyer activated his patrol lights and pulled her over, there was no immediate reason for fear. Traffic stops are designed to be routine, procedural, and controlled. Cara complied when Peyer instructed her to step out of her vehicle and walk with him toward a nearby overpass, an isolated location, poorly lit, and far from passing traffic. What should have been a brief encounter became a fatal one. While officially on duty, Peyer attacked her. He strangled Cara with his hands, cutting off her air as she fought back. Evidence later showed she resisted fiercely, leaving behind biological traces under her fingernails. There were no eyewitnesses. Within minutes, Peyer returned to his patrol duties, leaving Cara's body hidden in darkness beneath the roadway. In the early hours of December 28, 1986, Cara Nutt's body was discovered at the bottom of the ravine. The scene immediately raised alarms. The location of her body, the visible injuries, and the absence of any indication of an accidental fall pointed to violence. Investigators quickly ruled out suicide. What remained unclear was how a young woman traveling alone had ended up dead beneath a highway overpass, and who had last seen her alive. As the investigation unfolded, attention turned inward, toward the California Highway Patrol itself. Detectives reconstructed the timeline of officers working that stretch of road during the night of the murder. Peyer's name surfaced as the officer who had conducted the traffic stop involving Cara Nutt. Forensic evidence soon followed. Scratches were documented on Peyer's body, consistent with a struggle. Biological material found under Cara's fingernails matched him. Even more damaging were inconsistencies in Peyer's statements, small discrepancies in time, movement, and procedure that could not be reconciled with physical evidence. Piece by piece, the narrative shifted from uncertainty to clarity. The last person to see Cara alive was not a stranger in the shadows, but a uniformed officer sworn to protect her. In 1987, Craig Peyer was arrested and formally charged with first-degree murder. The news sent shockwaves across California. The idea that a highway patrol officer could commit such a crime during an official traffic stop shattered public confidence and forced uncomfortable questions about oversight, accountability, and power. The trial that followed was closely watched, not only for its legal outcome, but for what it symbolized, whether the justice system could hold one of its own fully accountable. In 1988, a jury delivered its verdict. Peyer was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Jurors rejected any suggestion that the killing was accidental or spontaneous. The evidence demonstrated intent, control, and abuse of authority. The sentence ensured that Peyer would spend decades behind bars, but it could not undo the loss of a young woman whose life ended during what should have been a safe, routine interaction. In 2017, the California Parole Board once again denied Peyer's request for release. Their decision emphasized the gravity of his actions and the enduring impact of abusing official power to commit violence. The ruling reinforced a message that had echoed through the decades since Carnot's death: authority does not excuse brutality, and trust, once violated in such a profound way, cannot be restored through time alone. As of 2025, Craig Peyer remains incarcerated, serving his life sentence without parole. His name is now permanently linked to one of the most infamous cases of law enforcement abuse in American history. The legacy of the case extends far beyond the courtroom, influencing policy changes, public awareness, and the installation of emergency call boxes and safety measures along California highways. Yet the core question remains unresolved in the public conscience. When a badge grants unquestioned compliance, how many seconds does it take for safety to turn into silence? Louis Eppolito, State, New York, 71 years old. Born in 1948 in Brooklyn, New York. The environment surrounding Louis Eppolito quietly shaped a worldview where the boundary between law enforcement and organized crime was never entirely clear. By the 1970s and into the 1980s, Eppolito had risen through the ranks of the New York Police Department, eventually becoming a detective. On paper, this was a position of prestige and responsibility. In practice, it granted him access to the most sensitive layers of the criminal justice system: confidential informants, witness identities, surveillance plans, and impending raids. Few people inside the city had a clearer picture of who law enforcement was watching and when they planned to strike. During this period, prosecutors later argued, Eppolito began quietly selling that information to the Lucci's crime family. The arrangement was simple and devastating: cash in exchange for knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the corruption escalated into direct participation in organized crime. Eppolito was no longer just leaking intelligence, he was actively enabling violence. According to federal investigators, he provided precise locations of targets, ensured police attention was diverted elsewhere, and helped coordinate assassinations carried out by mafia hitmen. At least 8 murders were ultimately linked to his involvement. These were not crimes of impulse. They were calculated operations where a sworn detective functioned as an internal shield, protecting killers from detection while standing inside the very institution tasked with stopping them. Between 1990 and 1992, Eppolito left the NYPD, officially stepping away from the badge. But retirement did not sever his criminal ties. Instead, it freed him from departmental oversight while allowing him to trade on his reputation as a former detective. The authority once conferred by his position followed him into civilian life, opening doors that would have remained closed to ordinary criminals. His identity as an ex-NYPD officer became a form of camouflage, deflecting suspicion even as he continued working with organized crime figures. In the mid-1990s, Eppolito relocated to Las Vegas, distancing himself geographically from New York while maintaining financial and criminal connections. There, he invested in real estate and became involved in money laundering operations designed to legitimize proceeds from past crimes. At the same time, he cultivated a strange second career, appearing in films and television shows as a tough, streetwise former cop. To the public, he was playing a role. To federal investigators, he was hiding in plain sight, using Hollywood and property deals to mask a criminal history written in blood. As the decade closed and the early 2000s began, federal authorities started re-examining a series of unresolved mafia killings from years earlier. The breakthrough came not from a single piece of evidence, but from accumulation. Cooperating mob informants began naming names. Financial analysts traced suspicious money flows. Patterns emerged, murders that should have triggered arrests but never did, suspects who vanished just ahead of police action. At the center of those patterns was a former NYPD detective who seemed to know too much, too often. Louis Eppolito's name surfaced repeatedly, no longer as a rumor, but as a connective thread tying violence to law enforcement betrayal. In 2005, the illusion finally collapsed. Eppolito was arrested and indicted on federal charges that included conspiracy to commit murder, murder for hire, racketeering, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. The arrest sent shockwaves through law enforcement nationwide. This was not a case of a rogue officer taking bribes. It was the exposure of a man who had allegedly functioned as an operational arm of the mafia while wearing a police shield. The 2006 federal trial laid bare the depth of the corruption. Prosecutors presented testimony detailing how Eppolito exploited his access, manipulated investigations, and enabled executions that victims never saw coming. The court concluded that he had not merely betrayed his oath, but weaponized it. The sentence reflected that judgment life in federal prison, plus more than 100 additional years. It was a symbolic calculation, ensuring that even the passage of time could not soften accountability. In 2009, appellate courts affirmed the conviction, closing the door on any serious attempt to overturn the verdict. The justice system had reached a final conclusion about who Eppolito was and what he had done. There would be no redemption arc, no technical escape. Louis Eppolito died in federal custody in 2019, still serving his life sentence. With his death came a final reckoning. The victims connected to his actions would never see him confront them in court again, and unanswered questions about other possible crimes died with him. His legacy remains one of the most chilling examples of institutional betrayal in modern American history, a reminder that when criminal organizations gain access to law enforcement from the inside, justice itself becomes a target. How many cases were buried because the gatekeeper chose profit over principle, and how many warning signs were ignored because the badge demanded trust? Edgar Verduzco, State, California, 35 years old. Born in California in the late 1980s to early 1990s, the early record showed no public criminal history before entering law enforcement. On the night of July 26, 2017, the incident happened. The danger did not arrive with sirens. It arrived with alcohol, speed, and a decision to drive. After hours of drinking while off duty, a personal vehicle was taken onto California freeways at an extreme pace. Investigators later reconstructed the data and found speeds approaching 150 miles per hour, far beyond any lawful or survivable margin. There was no emergency, no pursuit authorization, no public safety rationale. The collision involved a family traveling normally, a married couple, and their young son. The impact was catastrophic. Metal folded, momentum transferred, and within seconds 3 lives ended at the scene. There was no opportunity for intervention, no chance for bystanders to help, no medical response that could undo the physics of a high-speed, alcohol-fueled crash. The road became a crime scene, not because of intent to kill a specific person, but because of a conscious disregard for human life carried out at lethal speed. Arrest followed at the scene. Testing confirmed intoxication beyond legal limits. The facts were stark and uncomplicated: no duty assignment, no authorized chase, no exigent circumstances. Prosecutors in Los Angeles County answered that question with severity. Charges included multiple counts of second-degree murder, grounded in the theory that extreme recklessness can substitute for intent when the risk is obvious and the conduct voluntary. The case emphasized not a momentary lapse, but a sequence of choices: drinking, driving, accelerating, and continuing despite clear danger. The Los Angeles Police Department moved quickly on its own track, suspending the officer and then terminating employment. The separation was decisive, but it did not erase the broader damage. Media coverage intensified, fueled by the contrast between public trust and private conduct. What followed was a long procedural stretch from 2019 through 2024. Defense arguments focused on intoxication and state of mind, attempting to reframe the crash as a tragic accident rather than a criminal act. Prosecutors countered with data, expert testimony, and precedent, arguing that knowingly driving at extreme speeds, while impaired, demonstrates conscious disregard for life. Throughout the delay, the victim's family pressed for accountability, attending hearings and public forums, insisting that the passage of time not soften the meaning of 3 deaths. The case became a touchstone in debates over off-duty responsibility, whether authority carries an ethical weight that extends beyond the clock, and whether consequences should be calibrated differently when public servants are involved. In 2025, the court delivered its judgment. The sentence imposed 2 terms of 15 years to life for the murders, to be served concurrently, with additional penalties for dangerous driving and intoxication-related offenses. The ruling was explicit. A law enforcement title does not mitigate criminal responsibility. The court characterized the conduct as a conscious, lethal gamble, one that transformed a freeway into a killing field without warning. The sentence acknowledged both the scale of loss and the necessity of deterrence. After the verdict, the impact widened. The case reverberated through LAPD training programs and policy discussions, cited in ethics modules and risk management briefings. Agencies revisited guidelines on off-duty conduct, emphasizing that the public's trust does not switch off with the uniform. Discussions about vehicle safety, alcohol use, and accountability gained renewed urgency, not as abstract principles, but as lessons written in irreversible harm. The legacy of the case is not confined to a docket number. It sits at the intersection of power and restraint, illustrating how quickly ordinary roads become fatal when judgment collapses. 3 lives were erased in seconds, and a profession's image absorbed another fracture. The law responded with severity, but the larger question lingers. When those entrusted with public safety make private choices that predictably end in death, is punishment enough, or should prevention be treated as an obligation that never truly ends? Drew Peterson, State, Illinois, 71 years old. Born in Illinois in 1954, the trajectory appeared predictable: a career in local law enforcement, steady advancement, and the institutional confidence that comes with years inside the system. In 1992, a third marriage brought Kathleen Savio into a relationship that soon deteriorated into open conflict. By 2002, the tension had hardened into legal action when Savio filed for divorce. Court records and witness accounts described escalating disputes over finances and custody, arguments that grew sharper as the separation progressed. Friends and family later recalled fear, volatility, and a sense that the marriage had crossed from unhappy into dangerous. Yet within the rhythms of domestic litigation, these warning signs blended into paperwork and hearings, easy to miss amid routine legal noise. In March 2004, Savio was found dead in the bathtub of her home. The initial conclusion was deceptively simple: accidental drowning. There was no immediate criminal charge, no arrest, no public confrontation. The scene was processed and closed, and the death was filed away as a tragic but mundane outcome. With professional familiarity and credibility, suspicion never gained traction. The system moved on, and so did the man who would later stand at its center. Between 2004 and 2006, life appeared to reset. A new relationship formed quickly, followed by marriage to Stacy Peterson, a woman significantly younger. To outsiders, it looked like a second act. Fresh start, new family, old troubles behind. But beneath the surface, the pattern of control and conflict resurfaced, unnoticed or unchallenged, until the moment it could no longer be ignored. In October 2007, Stacy Peterson vanished. She was 23 years old. There was no goodbye note, no confirmed sighting, no physical evidence pointing to where she had gone. The explanation offered was casual and convenient. She had left to meet someone else and never returned. Yet the absence was total. As days stretched into weeks, the story collapsed under scrutiny. Media attention intensified, neighbors spoke, and the nation watched a mystery unfold in real time. Without a body or a clear crime scene, the case hovered in a legal gray zone, but public suspicion had already formed. The disappearance triggered a second look backward. By late 2007, investigators reopened the death of Kathleen Savio. What once appeared routine now looked incomplete. New forensic analysis challenged the original conclusion, identifying signs consistent with force and restraint. In 2008, the medical examiner officially ruled Savio's death a homicide, caused by drowning under pressure. A case once closed as an accident was now reframed as murder, and the timeline between the two women suddenly felt less like coincidence and more like progression. From 2009 through 2011, the focus narrowed. One man stood at the center of two narratives: a wife found dead, another missing without trace. Though Stacy's body was never recovered, the circumstantial gravity was undeniable. Investigators built parallel theories, one grounded in forensic proof, the other in pattern, behavior, and absence. The public narrative hardened, but the legal challenge remained formidable, proving murder without a body requires more than suspicion. In 2012, the case moved to trial for the murder of Kathleen Savio. Prosecutors relied on newly interpreted forensic evidence and a controversial but critical legal change in Illinois that allowed certain hearsay statements when the witness was unavailable due to death. The courtroom became a battleground over credibility, timing, and motive. The defense emphasized gaps and uncertainties. The prosecution emphasized sequence and control. The jury weighed not just evidence, but the story of a marriage ending in fear. The verdict arrived in 2013, a conviction for first-degree murder, followed by a sentence of 38 years in prison. Given age and statutory realities, it functioned as a life sentence. For Savio's family, it was validation long delayed. For the public, it was confirmation that familiarity with the system does not guarantee immunity forever. Prison did not end the danger. In 2015 and 2016, investigators uncovered an alleged plot to hire a hitman to kill the special prosecutor associated with the case. The scheme failed, but the intent carried weight. A second conviction followed in 2016, adding 40 more years for conspiracy to commit murder. The combined sentences sealed the outcome: no realistic path to release. The story leaves an enduring question. When expertise in law enforcement intersects with domestic power and private violence, how many warning signs are dismissed as routine? And when a system finally responds, how many years and how many lives have already been lost? Kenneth Bluew, State, Michigan, 50 years old. Born in Michigan in the late 1970s to early 1980s, Kenneth Bluew entered adulthood without any publicly documented criminal record. Bluew was involved in a hidden romantic relationship with Jennifer Webb, a young woman whose pregnancy dramatically raised the stakes. The relationship carried multiple risks. Webb was expecting a child. Bluew was a sworn officer actively serving in uniform. An exposure threatened his career, reputation, and personal standing in the community. What might have remained a concealed affair instead became a pressure point, one where fear of consequence collided with access to power. Investigators later argued that this convergence created a motive rooted not in passion, but in control and self-preservation. In February 2011, that pressure reached a breaking point. While on duty, Bluew met with Jennifer Webb. The encounter escalated into a serious confrontation. According to evidence later presented in court, the situation turned violent. Webb was strangled, a method indicating close physical domination and sustained force. She was then shot and killed. The sequence mattered. Forensic findings suggested restraint and assault before the gunshot, undermining any narrative of a spontaneous or defensive act. What followed was a calculated attempt to erase responsibility. The scene was staged to look like a suicide. The placement of the weapon, the positioning of the body, and the initial framing of the incident were all designed to align with a self-inflicted death. In that moment, Bluew relied on his professional familiarity with crime scenes and investigative shortcuts, how first impressions can steer conclusions, how early assumptions often persist. The goal was simple: end the story before it began. But the story did not hold. Almost immediately, inconsistencies surfaced. The physical evidence did not align with suicide. Injuries on Webb's body suggested restraint and force inconsistent with self-harm. Ballistics and wound analysis raised questions about angle, distance, and sequence. What should have been a closed case became unstable. Independent investigators were brought in, and the narrative began to fracture under scrutiny. As the 2011 investigation deepened, the truth emerged piece by piece. Medical findings confirmed signs of strangulation that could not be explained away. Additional evidence indicated that Webb had been overpowered before being shot. The staged elements at the scene were identified as deliberate manipulation rather than coincidence. What initially appeared ambiguous now pointed decisively toward homicide. The focus narrowed quickly, and Kenneth Bluew, once shielded by his badge, became the primary suspect. The case moved swiftly once the evidence aligned. Prosecutors framed the crime as intentional, emphasizing both the violence itself and the subsequent effort to obstruct justice. This was not just a killing, it was an abuse of authority designed to distort the investigative process. The pregnancy added another layer of gravity, underscoring the human cost of the decisions made that night. Public reaction intensified as details became known, particularly the fact that the crime occurred while Bluew was actively on duty. In 2012, the trial delivered a decisive outcome. Kenneth Bluew was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The court imposed additional sentences, totaling 65 to 100 years, for related sexual assault and violent offenses. The judgment was explicit: the murder was premeditated, and the staging of the scene constituted a deliberate attempt to interfere with justice. The sentence ensured that Bluew would never regain his freedom. The aftermath rippled beyond the courtroom. The case shocked the Michigan community, not only because of the brutality, but because of who committed it. A pregnant woman killed by a uniformed officer, followed by an attempted cover-up, struck at the core of public trust. The department faced scrutiny over hiring practices, supervision, and how officers' private conduct is monitored. Broader conversations followed about how deaths initially labeled as suicides, especially those involving law enforcement, are investigated and reviewed. As of 2025, Kenneth Bluew remains incarcerated, serving life without parole. There is no path to release, no remaining legal avenue that alters the outcome. Jennifer Webb's death stands as a permanent indictment of how power can be weaponized when fear overrides accountability. The case leaves a haunting question behind: How many other scenes have been staged convincingly enough to close a file? And how many truths depend on someone choosing to look twice? Across these cases, the common thread is not just violence, but the silence that followed it, silence protected by rank, routine, and credibility. Justice arrived late, sometimes incomplete, and sometimes only after irreversible loss. These stories force an uncomfortable reckoning with oversight, accountability, and the limits of trust in institutions built on authority. When those sworn to protect exploit the system from within, the damage extends far beyond individual victims. Do you believe these outcomes represent justice served, or proof that the system only corrects itself after it fails?